years, humanity has been terrified of the dark water. We built our cities on the solid earth, but the ocean remained an untamed monster, capable of swallowing ships and sailors without a single trace. To fight back against this darkness, we built towers of light on the very edge of the world. Lighthouses were our promise to those out on the water, a promise that no matter how violent the storm, no matter how black the night, there was a safe way home. But the people who kept that promise, the lighthouse keepers, had to pay a terrible price. They were forced to live on isolated rocks, miles away from civilization, surrounded by an endless, violent ocean. They were completely alone. And in that absolute isolation, the human mind begins to play tricks. Or worse, it begins to notice the things that are hiding in the dark. Welcome to our new documentary. Over the next hour, we are going to explore the terrifying reality of extreme isolation. We will look at the true stories of the people who stood watch at the edge of the world, and the nightmares that came out of the water to meet them. This is Chapter 1, the Blackwood Reef. The coast of Maine is famous for its jagged, unforgiving rocks and its unpredictable weather. In the late autumn, the ocean turns into a freezing, gray, churning mass that can rip a modern ship apart. 30 miles off this brutal coastline, sitting on a solitary spike of black rock, is the Blackwood Reef Lighthouse. It is a massive, circular tower built from blocks of dark gray granite, standing over 150 feet tall. For over a century, it has been battered by hurricane-force winds and waves that crash completely over its highest windows. In November of 1993, before the tower was fully automated, 2 men were stationed there for a 6-week shift. The head keeper was a man named Elias. He was, in his late 50s, a hardened veteran of the sea who had spent most of his life in absolute solitude. His assistant was a 24-year-old named Thomas, a young man who had taken the job to save money and find some quiet time to read. The first 2 weeks were routine. The days were filled with painting, cleaning the massive brass lenses of the lantern, and maintaining the diesel generators that kept the light turning. The routine was their only defense against the crushing, heavy silence of the ocean. But on the 17th day, the barometer began to drop rapidly. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind shifted, howling around the curved stone of the tower like a dying animal. A massive nor'easter storm was moving in. By nightfall, the waves were reaching 30 feet. The ocean was slamming into the base of the lighthouse with the force of an earthquake. The entire granite tower vibrated with every impact. Elias and Thomas secured the heavy iron storm doors at the base of the tower and climbed up to the living quarters on the 4th level. The sound of the storm was deafening. They could not hear each other speak unless they shouted. On the 3rd day of the storm, the underwater communication cable that connected the lighthouse to the mainland snapped. The radio went dead, filling the room with a constant, hissing static. They were completely cut off. Two men trapped inside a stone cylinder, surrounded by a violent, freezing ocean 30 miles away from the rest of the human race. The psychological toll of the storm began to set in. Thomas stopped reading. He sat in his small chair, staring at the curved stone wall, flinching every time a massive wave struck the tower. The constant, thunderous noise was making it impossible to sleep. On the fourth night, the storm reached its peak. The wind was screaming at over 100 miles per hour. It was 2 in the morning. Elias was in the lantern room at the very top of the tower, making sure the light was rotating smoothly. Thomas was in the kitchen on the 3rd level, trying to boil water on a small kerosene stove. Suddenly, the deafening roar of the wind seemed to pause for just a fraction of a second. And in that tiny moment of silence, Thomas heard something that made his blood run cold. It was coming from the very bottom of the tower. It sounded like a heavy, metallic scrape, like someone was dragging a thick iron chain across the stone floor of the entry room. Thomas froze. The heavy iron storm doors at the bays were locked from the inside with 3 massive steel deadbolts. Even if a boat could somehow survive the 30-foot waves and reach the rock, no one could open those doors from the outside. He convinced himself it was just the sound of the equipment shifting in the storm. He turned back to the stove. Then he heard it again. This time, it was a heavy, wet footstep on the iron spiral staircase that connected the levels. Clang. Thomas stopped breathing. He stared at the dark archway that led to the stairs. Clang. The footstep was slow, deliberate, and it was moving up. Thomas backed away from the stove, his hands shaking. He grabbed a heavy, iron fireplace poker from the corner of the room. He stood in the shadows, his eyes locked on the dark archway. Clang. The sound was getting louder. Whatever was coming up the stairs was heavy, and it was soaking wet. Thomas could hear the sound of water dripping onto the iron grates with every step. He wanted to scream for Elias, but his voice was completely caught in his throat. He knew that if he yelled, whatever was on the stairs would hear him. Clang. The footsteps reached the 2nd level. They were only 1 flight of stairs below him now. The smell of the ocean suddenly filled the small kitchen. But it wasn't the clean, salty smell of the sea breeze. It smelled like rotting kelp, stagnant water, and ancient, dead things. Thomas raised the iron poker above his head. He pressed his back against the curved stone wall, waiting. The wet footsteps started climbing the final flight of stairs to the kitchen. Clang, dot, clang, clang. The sound stopped right at the edge of the dark archway. Thomas could hear a low, wet breathing. It sounded like lungs completely filled with ocean water, struggling to take in air. He waited for a face to step out of the shadows. He braced himself to swing the heavy iron bar with all his strength. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the darkness and grabbed the edge of the stone archway. It was a massive hand, covered in a thick, grayish green slime. The fingers were unnaturally long, and the fingernails were jagged and black. The skin looked like it had been underwater for a very long time. Thomas let out a terrified, guttural scream. He swung the iron poker blindly into the darkness. The heavy metal bar struck solid stone with a shower of orange sparks. The hand was gone. The breathing stopped. Elias came running down the spiral stairs from the lantern room, holding a heavy flashlight. He found Thomas collapsed on the floor of the kitchen, crying hysterically, pointing at the empty archway. Elias searched every single level of the lighthouse. He checked the storage rooms. He checked the heavy iron storm doors at the base. The doors were still locked from the inside with the 3 steel deadbolts. There was no sign of forced entry. But when Elias shined his flashlight on the iron spiral stairs, he saw it, starting from the very bottom of the tower and leading all the way up to the edge of the kitchen were massive, wet footprints, puddles of dark, foul-smelling water that slowly dripped through the iron grates. Someone or something had been inside the tower with them. It had climbed the stairs, and then it had simply vanished. The storm broke 2 days later. When the Coast Guard ship finally arrived to repair the communication cable, they found Thomas completely catatonic. He refused to speak. He refused to look at the ocean. He was taken to a psychiatric hospital on the mainland and never returned to the sea. Elias stayed. He finished his shift, but he never went down to the base of the tower at night ever again, because he knew that when the storms roll in and the wind screams loud enough to drown out your own thoughts, the ocean doesn't just crash against the walls. Sometimes it figures out how to walk inside. When we return in Chapter 2, we will leave the stormy shores of Maine and travel to a different kind of isolation. We will explore what happens when the tower you are guarding is surrounded not by water, but by an endless ocean of dark, ancient trees. Welcome back. In our first chapter, we saw how the ocean can isolate us, trapping us in stone towers while the water rages outside. But water is not the only thing that can cut a person off from the rest of the world. Sometimes the isolation is completely silent. It is a desert of blinding white where the temperature drops so low that taking a deep breath can freeze your lungs. This is Chapter 2, The White Out. Northern Alaska is one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet. During the winter, the sun disappears completely for over 2 months. This period is known as the polar night. The landscape is buried under 10 feet of snow, and the only light comes from the cold, shifting glow of the aurora borealis. In the winter of 2019, a 32-year-old meteorologist named David was stationed at a remote climate observation post 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The station was a small, heavily insulated pod elevated on steel legs to prevent it from being buried by the snowdrifts. David was supposed to be there with a partner, but 3 days before their deployment, his partner suffered a severe medical emergency and had to be airlifted out. Because the data collection was critical, David volunteered to take the 2-month shift entirely alone. He was a professional. He knew the risks. He had 2 months of freeze-dried food, a massive diesel generator, and a satellite phone for weekly check-ins. For the first 3 weeks, the absolute isolation was peaceful. David spent his days reading instruments, maintaining the exterior sensors, and watching the endless, dark horizon. But on the 24th day, a massive blizzard hit the region. It was a whiteout condition. The wind speed reached 80 miles per hour, picking up the loose snow and creating a solid wall of flying ice. Visibility dropped to 0. David could not even see the steel railing of his own exterior deck. He was trapped inside the small 10 by 20-foot pod. The wind screamed against the reinforced walls, a constant, deafening roar that made it impossible to think clearly. On the 3rd night of the blizzard, the primary diesel generator failed. The low, comforting hum of the engine simply sputtered and died. The sudden silence inside the pod was heavier than the storm outside. The primary heating system shut down immediately. David grabbed his heavy extreme weather parka and his flashlight. He had to go outside to the utility shed, located 30 feet away from the main pod, to manually restart the generator. If he failed, the temperature inside the pod would drop to -40 degrees within an hour. He would freeze to death in his own bed. He tied a heavy nylon safety rope around his waist and secured the other end to the heavy metal handle of the pod door. In a whiteout, if you walk 10 feet away from your shelter without a rope, you will lose your direction and never find your way back. He pushed the heavy steel door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture on his eyelashes. He stepped out into the absolute chaos of the storm. He kept his hand firmly on the safety rope, blindly taking step after step through the waist-deep snow. He reached the utility shed, forced the frozen door open, and stepped inside. He spent 20 minutes working on the generator with freezing, stiff fingers. Finally, the engine coughed, choked, and roared back to life. David breathed a sigh of relief. He turned around, grabbed his safety rope, and began the 30-foot walk back to the main pod. The wind was pushing against his back. He kept his head down, shining his flashlight at his own boots. But halfway back to the pod, his flashlight beam caught something in the snow. David stopped. He wiped the ice from his goggles and looked closer. Just 2 feet to the right of his safety rope, there was a set of fresh footprints. They were large, deep impressions in the snow. But they weren't made by heavy winter boots. They were the distinct, unmistakable shape of bare human feet. David felt a cold terror that had nothing to do with the temperature. The footprints were completely fresh. They hadn't been filled in by the blowing snow yet. That meant whoever made them had walked past him just seconds ago. He shined his flashlight out into the swirling white void. He yelled out, "Hello, is someone there?" The wind swallowed his voice completely. There was no answer. He looked back down at the bare footprints. They were moving in a straight line, heading directly toward the main pod. David panicked. He pulled himself along the safety rope as fast as he could, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the heavy steel door of the pod. The door, which he had pulled tightly shut to keep the heat in, was now standing wide open. The interior of the pod was completely dark. David stood on the metal deck, staring into the pitch-black opening. The wind howled around him, pushing him toward the dark door. He reached to his heavy belt and unclipped a large steel ice axe. He gripped it tightly in his right hand. He stepped inside the pod and slammed the heavy door shut behind him, engaging the heavy steel deadbolt. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled. The pod was silent again. He slowly reached up and flipped the main light switch. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed to life. The pod was empty. The small kitchen area, the communication desk, the narrow bed, nothing was out of place. David let out a long, shaky breath. He convinced himself that the wind must have blown the door open. He convinced himself that the footprints were just strange shapes carved by the drifting snow. The human brain looks for patterns in the chaos. It was just isolation, paranoia. He took off his heavy parka and set his ice axe on the desk. He walked over to the small radio console to check the frequency. As he reached for the dials, the radio suddenly clicked on by itself. The speaker hissed with static for a moment, and then a voice came through. It was a completely clear, localized transmission. It wasn't coming from the mainland. It was coming from a short-range frequency, meaning the transmitter was less than a mile away. The voice on the radio was David's own voice. It was a recording of the radio check he had made 2 days ago. The recording played, "David here. Station is secure. Weather is holding." Then the recording stopped. The radio hissed with static again. And then a different voice spoke. It was a voice that sounded like grinding ice. It was low, slow, and raspy. The voice said, "The station is not secure, David. Look under the bed." David froze. Every muscle in his body locked tight. He stared at the narrow cot in the corner of the small room. The space under the bed was completely cast in deep shadow. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just slowly backed away toward the heavy steel door, his eyes locked on the dark space beneath the mattress. From the shadow under the bed, a single, pale, bare foot slowly slid out onto the linoleum floor. David didn't wait. He didn't grab his coat. He threw the deadbolt open, threw himself out into the raging -40-degree blizzard, and ran blindly into the white void. He was found 2 days later by a military rescue helicopter. He had managed to find a small ice cave and survived by pure miracle, suffering severe frostbite. When the rescue team entered the climate observation pod, they found it completely empty. The radio was smashed to pieces, and carved deep into the metal floor under the bed were 3 words: "You cannot hide. We build walls to protect ourselves from the elements. We use thick steel and heavy locks to keep the cold out. But when you are entirely alone at the edge of the world, you have to wonder, are you locking the nightmares out, or are you just locking yourself inside with them?" When we return in Chapter 3, we will leave the frozen wasteland and travel underground. We will explore the terrifying reality of what happens when the isolation is buried hundreds of feet beneath the earth. Welcome back. We have looked at the terror of the open ocean and the freezing isolation of the Arctic tundra. But in both of those places, you can still look up and see the sky. You can still see the stars. There's a different kind, isolation. An isolation where the sky is replaced by millions of tons of solid rock, where the darkness is absolute and the silence is so heavy it makes your ears ring. This is Chapter 3, The Deep Shaft. In the vast deserts of Nevada, there are thousands of abandoned silver and copper mines. They are deep, winding labyrinths carved into the earth over a century ago. Most of them are sealed off, but in 2021, a massive mining corporation bought an old silver mine with the intention of reopening the deepest veins. Before the heavy machinery could be brought in, they needed to monitor the structural integrity and gas levels. They hired a 35-year-old former military engineer named Marcus to act as the overnight seismic technician. His station was not on the surface. It was located on level 4 of the main shaft, exactly 2,000 feet straight down into the earth. To get to his post, Marcus had to ride a rusted, heavy iron cage elevator down a pitch-black shaft for 15 minutes. Above him was a half-mile of solid rock. Below him were levels 5 and 6, which had been abandoned and flooded since the 1920s. His station was a small, heavily reinforced concrete room built directly into the rock wall. It had a desk, a bank of monitors, and a heavy steel door that opened out into the dark, cavernous main tunnel of level 4. Marcus was a man who enjoyed the quiet. For the first 2 weeks, he sat in his concrete room, drinking coffee, reading books, and logging the seismic data. The only sound was the low hum of his ventilation fan and the occasional groan of the deep earth shifting around him. But on the 15th night, the earth stopped being quiet. It was 3:15 in the morning. Marcus was staring at his computer screen when he heard a sound echoing from the dark tunnel outside his open door. It was a sharp, metallic rhythm. Clink, clink, clink. It sounded exactly like an iron pickaxe striking solid stone. Marcus froze. He looked out the heavy steel door into the tunnel. The beam of light from his station cut through the swirling rock dust. But it was quickly swallowed by the absolute, crushing blackness of the mine. He checked his monitors. He was the only person scheduled to be underground. The surface crew had left. He picked up his two-way radio and pressed the button to call the surface supervisor. The radio just emitted a low, dead static. The rock was too thick. He was completely cut off. The sound echoed again. Clink, clink, clink. It wasn't coming from level 4. The acoustics of the deep earth are strange, but Marcus could tell the sound was traveling up the main elevator shaft. It was coming from level 5, the flooded, abandoned level directly beneath him. Marcus grabbed his heavy, industrial flashlight and walked out of his concrete room. The air in the main tunnel was freezing and smelled like rust and old water. He walked to the edge of the elevator shaft. He shined his flashlight down into the abyss. The beam disappeared into the darkness. He couldn't see the water. He couldn't see the bottom. He yelled down the shaft. "Hey Dot, who is down there? This is a restricted area." The echo of his voice bounced off the rock walls, fading into the deep. "Hey Dot, hey. Hey Dot." And then the sound of the pickaxe stopped. Marcus waited, his heart thumping heavily in his chest. He stood at the edge of the drop, listening to the absolute silence of the earth. Suddenly, the heavy steel cables in the elevator shaft began to vibrate. The massive mechanical winch on the surface, 2,000 feet above him, had just engaged. The iron cage elevator was moving. Marcus looked at the mechanical floor indicator dial, bolted to the rock wall. The arrow wasn't pointing at the surface, and it wasn't pointing at level 4. Someone or something had just pushed the call button on level 5. The elevator was going down into the flooded tunnels. Marcus stood paralyzed. He watched the thick, greasy steel cables sliding down into the dark. He heard the heavy iron cage plunge into the stagnant water of the 5th level with a massive, echoing splash. Then, the winch stopped. For 3 agonizing minutes, there was no movement. Marcus stared down the shaft, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He knew that no human could survive in the freezing, toxic water of the abandoned level. Then the cables groaned. The winch engaged again. The elevator was coming up. Marcus took 3 steps back from the edge of the shaft. He reached to his belt and unclipped it. It was the only weapon he had. He watched the dark shaft as the sound of the rising cage grew louder. He could hear the water dripping off the iron floor of the elevator. The heavy cage finally rose out of the darkness and stopped at level 4 with a loud, metallic screech. Marcus shined his flashlight directly into the cage. It was completely empty. There was no one inside. But sitting perfectly in the center of the wet iron floor was a single, rusted, antique mining lantern. The kind they used 100 years ago. And the glass was still warm. Marcus didn't breathe. He slowly stepped forward to look at the lantern. As he moved closer to the cage, a voice whispered from the dark, unmapped tunnel directly behind him. The voice was dry. It sounded like dust and crushed rock. It whispered, "Shift is over. Go back to the light." Marcus didn't look back. He threw himself into the iron cage, slammed his hand onto the surface button, and collapsed onto the wet floor as the elevator rocketed upward. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck on the surface. He quit his job that same night and never went back to the desert. When the company sent a heavily armed security team down to level for the next morning, they found nothing. But when they checked the digital logs of the elevator, they found something impossible. The elevator had indeed been called from level 5. But the electrical call button on that level had been removed and filled with concrete 50 years ago. There was no physical way to call the cage from the deep. We are terrified of being buried alive. We hate the thought of the heavy earth pressing down on us. But maybe we shouldn't be afraid of the dirt. Maybe we should be afraid of what was already buried there, waiting in the dark for us to dig it back up. When we return for our 4th and final chapter, we will look at the ultimate form of isolation. The isolation of being trapped in a place that looks exactly like your own home, but isn't. Welcome to our 4th and final chapter. Over the past 50 minutes, we have explored the isolation of the deep ocean, the freezing tundra, and the buried earth. We have seen how distance and nature can cut a person off from the rest of humanity. But the most terrifying isolation of all is not a place you travel to. It is the isolation that finds you in the one place you are supposed to be safe, your own home. This is Chapter 4, The Perfect Storm. In January of 2020, an unprecedented ice storm struck the Pacific Northwest. Millions of trees were coated in 2 inches of solid ice, bringing down power lines and blocking major highways. For over a week, rural communities were completely paralyzed. Sarah, a 30-year-old freelance writer, lived alone in an old 2-story farmhouse at the end of a long dirt road in Oregon. When the storm hit on a Tuesday evening, the power grid failed immediately. The backup generator in her barn wouldn't start because the doors were frozen shut by 3 inches of solid ice. Her cell phone had no signal. The landline was dead. She was trapped inside her own house. But she had plenty of firewood, canned food, and battery-powered lanterns. She was prepared to wait it out. For the first 3 days, the silence was peaceful. She read by lantern light and slept by the fire in the living room. The world outside was a frozen, crystalline prison. No one could get in, and she could not get out. But on the 4th night, the psychological toll of the absolute silence began to crack her nerves. She was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when she heard a sound from the kitchen. It wasn't the sound of the house settling or the ice cracking outside. It was a deliberate, sliding sound, the distinct noise of a wooden kitchen drawer being pulled open. Sarah stopped breathing. She stared at the dark archway leading to the kitchen. The only light in the house was the dying fire in front of her. She stood up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She picked up the heavy iron fire poker. She crept silently toward the kitchen. She raised her lantern. The kitchen was empty, but the large drawer next to the sink, the one where she kept her sharpest butcher knives, was standing wide open. Sarah panicked. She checked the front door, the back door, and all the ground floor windows. Everything was deadbolted from the inside. The heavy ice on the outside of the house made it physically impossible for anyone to have broken in without shattering the glass. She was completely alone. The house was sealed tight. She convinced herself she had left the drawer open earlier that day. The isolation was just playing tricks on her mind. She went back to the living room and tried to sleep. But at 2 in the morning, she woke up to a new sound. It was coming from directly above her, from the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. It was the slow, heavy creak of footsteps walking across the hardwood floor. Creak, creak, creak. The footsteps were pacing back and forth, right above her head. Sarah clamped her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. The ice storm outside was still raging. No police could reach her. No neighbors could hear her. She was trapped in a wooden box with someone else. She grabbed her flashlight and the iron poker. She crept up the stairs, her bare feet making no sound. She reached the 2nd floor landing. The door to the master bedroom was slightly open. She pushed the door open with the tip of the poker and flashed her light inside. The room was empty, but the heavy oak wardrobe in the corner of the room was shifted 2 feet away from the wall. Sarah walked over to it. Behind the wardrobe, there was a small, square access panel cut into the drywall, leading into the crawl space under the roof. The panel was removed. She aimed her flashlight into the dark hole. Inside the crawl space, she saw a filthy sleeping bag, a pile of empty food wrappers from her own kitchen, and several of her own photographs torn into pieces. Someone had been living in the walls of her house for weeks, watching her, waiting. And then she heard the front door deadbolt click downstairs. The person hadn't been upstairs. They had lured her up there so they could get downstairs. Sarah ran to the top of the stairs and looked down into the dark living room. Standing at the bottom of the stairs, silhouetted by the dying embers of the fire, was a tall, thin man holding one of her butcher knives. He didn't run toward the door. He just looked up at her and smiled in the dark. Sarah ran into the bedroom, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and locked it. She pushed a heavy dresser in front of the door. She sat on the floor, terrified, listening to the slow, heavy footsteps walking up the stairs. The man didn't bang on the door. He didn't yell. He just dragged the tip of the butcher knife slowly up and down the wooden door panel from the outside. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He knew she couldn't call for help. He knew the ice storm wasn't going to melt for days. He had all the time in the world. Sarah survived by breaking her second-story window and jumping onto the icy roof of the porch, fracturing her leg and dragging herself 2 miles through the freezing ice to a neighboring farm. When the police finally reached her house 3 days later, the man was gone. He had vanished back into the frozen woods, but carved deep into the wooden door of her bedroom were the words, "Thank you for keeping me warm." We lock our doors to keep the monsters out. We build our homes to protect ourselves from the extreme elements. But when the ultimate storm hits and the isolation is absolute, you have to ask yourself one terrifying question. Did you lock the monster out? Or did you lock yourself inside with it? Over the last hour, we have traveled to the most isolated places on Earth. We have faced the dark water, the frozen ice, the deep earth, and the empty walls of our own homes. Isolation is not just a physical state. It is a psychological mirror. When all the noise of the world is stripped away, the only thing left to listen to is your own fear. Thank you for surviving this 1-hour journey into extreme isolation. If you made it to the very end of this documentary, leave a comment down below and tell me which of these 4 true stories terrified you the most. If you want to hear more deep dives into the dark, the unsolved, and the unknown, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and give this video a like. Stay safe, always check the locks, and I will see you in the next nightmare.